So I mentioned that today is very special, not only because we have a great crowd, but we have really four accomplished scholars here. I want to congratulate you one by one. Erika from the University of Turku, Finland. Welcome, Erika. And Rebecca from also Finland, from Aalto University. Emanuela from University of Vienna, and Catherine from University of Sydney. As you can imagine, they're coming from 3 different time zones, very early for Catherine, a bit late for our gals in Finland, but we really appreciate it. And this is really a special occasion where we get to congratulate you before an audience of some 400 folks on your accomplishment. Obviously, you are the winners of the GIBS Decade Award for the paper you published in 10 years ago, a decade ago, and has become a seminal paper and a groundbreaking paper. Obviously, this was a big reason why the selection committee identified your paper as a paper that had a lasting contribution. So we give our sincere thanks to you for developing that paper and publishing it, and also congratulations to you. I just checked today. In fact, your paper has received more than some 1,000 Google citations, but the committee that looked at your paper and examined it found several merits to talk about. Very briefly, I don't want to take a lot of time, but very briefly, they said that the article raises the standards for qualitative research. It certainly does. It provides tools for reaching theoretical rigor in qualitative studies, case studies, and it enhances the power of qualitative research for developing theory. So you offer a great typology of research methods for case studies. You talk about, and we'll talk about these today, inductive theory building, natural experiments, interpretive sense making, and of course, you make a strong case, contextualized explanations and causal explanations. So I will stop there, but I'd like to start with a question to you all. Every paper has a story, right? The way it develops, it evolves, and it finally gets published. It's a long life cycle, actually. It has its life cycle of its own. So perhaps you can start us by commenting on how you got going. 4 of you from 3 different countries. And I know Emanuela was in a different country when you were doing this in the UK. How you got started and how you developed the paper. So you can maybe share some personal insights on that.
Yep, thank you very much, Tamir. Thank you for the generous introduction as well. And good morning from Sydney, everyone. Yeah, so we'll have more to say about the motivation for the paper later in our discussion, but just briefly, our ideas for it had been brewing for a number of years, actually. We can trace them back to our own experiences of doing our PhDs and the frustrations we'd had in trying to follow the advice we'd been given. We'd written other papers on the case study by then, which meant that we were already quite immersed in the topic and the literature. We'd been teaching qualitative methods to PhD students, and we'd noticed the tremendous need for guidance beyond go and read Yin and Eisenhardt, which is what we had been told ourselves as PhD students.
And I also think we had the timing on our side. So there was the call for the GIBS special issue on qualitative methods, which really offered a wonderful opportunity for us. Now, we had something to say. We were all very dissatisfied with the state of qualitative research in IB. And we felt that nothing would change if we didn't start raising questions and discussing it. So we had a mission, and I think we still have.
Wonderful, wonderful. And you know, it's the paper is also interesting and significant because it's a very successful collaboration. among 4 scholars. And I know pairs of you have had collaborated before, but this was probably the first time all 4 of you got together on the paper. So for our audience here, who may be anxious to learn about, what makes collaborations successful? What are the key features of successful collaboration across different colleagues and backgrounds, who provide some common strengths as well as some complementary strengths?
Well, I think that as IB researchers, we really welcome the challenge to engage in this cross-border, cross-cultural collaboration. So indeed, in the past, we have worked with each other, but it was the first time that all the 4 of us was working on this project. And I think that, as Catherine and Rebecca mentioned, the key glue that brought us together were our PhD experiences. The fact that we have experienced challenges during our PhD or during our own research, seeking a way to address these challenges and perhaps provide some food for thought for future researchers. I'm wondering, Erika, what do you think, what has helped you think in this collaboration?
Well, I echo the Catherine and Rebecca and what you already said about this, our shared interest in the topic. And we were very committed in it, and that helped a lot. So that we had loads of different meetings during the process. We Skyped a lot, we brainstormed, we revised our thoughts, we went back to the drawing board, reevaluated, discussed, negotiated, and compromised. So it was a very hands-on, very active and intensive project, and that was also very fruitful. Also, the fact that we were in different time zones helped a lot. So while we were working, Catherine was sleeping. When Catherine woke up, she took up what the Europeans had been doing in the middle. So 24/7, the paper was like progressing. And then, of course, sometimes we can also thank, let's say, unexpected events. So, for example, when the Icelandic volcano erupted in 2010, I happened to be in Sydney visiting Catherine. I couldn't return. Of course, it's not an awful place to be stuck in Sydney. So that helped us a lot when we were intensely writing the paper at that time. But yes, also, Emanuela, you were on your sabbatical in Finland. That helped as well. Please tell us more.
Yes, thank you, Erika. So apart from experiencing exotic Finland, I think I was very grateful at that time to Rebecca for hosting me at Aalto University. And I think being in Finland and collocating with Rebecca and Erika was extremely useful, given that we were engaging in a very daunting task, coding masses of papers. So this has been very instrumental in terms of moving forward the project. Obviously, we were trying to make the best out of every situation. So I recall meeting in academic conferences and always making sure that we isolate time to work on the paper, and obviously meeting in different coffee places all over the world, trying to make the best of these coffee places, testing the assumption that if we change context, then this is going to impact our creativity. So I think that that was also an extremely useful aspect in this process. And I think that talking about the creative process, it might be a good idea for me to share the slides so we can talk about the motivation of the paper and try to go a bit deeper in what we have been trying to do. So now we'll try to share my screen, and I'm hoping that technology is on my side.
Yeah, it's good.
So let's kick off. Let's go a bit deeper in the creative process, and let's kick off with the motivation of the paper.
Thank you, Emanuela. Yes, in IB, much of the qualitative research then as now follows the Eisenhardt template, which dates back to the 1980s. At that time, qualitative management researchers were still very much struggling to legitimize their work in the eyes of the quantitative mainstream. This type of case research aims at building theory from multiple cases. Eisenhardt argues that the case study is ideal for producing new theory that can be tested quantitatively. Famously, this makes the case study exploratory in nature, often justified by the limited amount of previous work that's been done in the area. So here in this figure, you can see what we've termed the positivist cycle of theorizing that this type of case study assumes. There are two aspects to knowledge production in the figure. And on the left-hand side, you can see where the case study fits in, that is developing theory from your observational data. And on the right-hand side, that's the quantitative hypothesis testing deductive mainstream that I just mentioned. So if you have this model in your head, the aim for the case study researcher is to deliver propositions that the mainstream, over on the right-hand side, can test for you. So this sounds all very well and logical, but what's wrong with this picture?
Yeah, well, that was the question that we were asking ourselves. And we realized that actually not all qualitative researchers agreed with Eisenhardt. They were actually quite critical of her work because she limited qualitative research to inductive theory building only. And these critics were arguing that actually induction is just a myth. In fact, philosophers have been making this point for a long time already. So when we as researchers go to the field, we always have preconceived theoretical ideas. We don't have a tabula rasa, a clear mind, a clean slate. So these ideas, these preconceived theoretical ideas, influence both data collection and analysis. And in fact, this knowledge of prior theory ensures that we are not collecting data randomly. Now, we should also keep in mind as IB researchers that our field is all about context. And the Eisenhardt type of case studies are in fact very thin on context. But Erika, you will next talk us through how we took this critique forward.
Yes, let's unpack the matrix a bit and focus first on the two dimensions, so causal explanation and contextualization. And we started off with the critique with the view that inductive theorizing is the only alternative way for cases to theorize. And during the analysis, the two dimensions gained form and contextualized explanation emerged as the strong approach in the matrix. Causal explanations and contextualization were treated as opposites or alternatives in previous research, and not as compatible aspects enabling case-based theorizing. When researchers seek for explanations, they would strip away context. And on the other hand, when they would include context, they would provide rich contextual descriptions and miss explanatory power in turn. So the two dimensions of the matrix, the causal explanation and contextualization, were challenged during the research process, and we really had to work on those. Inductive theorizing roadmap that was already mentioned uses context only in setting the scene, but not in explaining the findings. And they often end with propositions, but they are correlational, not causal. Therefore, inductive theorizing is placed in the weak corner of the matrix. Interpretive sense-making and natural experiment in turn are also well-established methods observed in the analysis, but they compromise in either of the dimensions and thus supported the limiting view that cases cannot theorize via both explaining and contextualizing at the same time. Philosophically, if we look at the matrix here, the matrix highlights three main views of reality. So qualitative positivism located on the lower half of the matrix, so quadrants 1 and 2, and interpretivism and critical realism on the upper half of the matrix. As a result of our analysis, we introduced a fourth quadrant, the number 4 cell here, contextualized explanation. And that is the most, let's say, our key contribution as well. So Rebecca, could you open up contextualized explanation a bit more, please?
Thanks, Erika. So what Erika just explained to you is really the debate between different qualitative traditions, so not between qualitative and quantitative research. And studies in the fourth quadrant, contextualized explanation, they aim at answering the why question. So researchers in this tradition, they typically seek to produce local explanations, so not generalizable findings. And for them, especially history and process are important in producing accounts. Now, as our label suggests, context becomes part of the explanation. It has explanatory power. It's not just description, as many of us think. So put differently, researchers explain in context rather than away from context. And if you don't take contextual factors into account, you may end up producing a simplistic, an incomplete, and potentially even a misleading explanation. So in the paper, we argue that researchers engaging in this mode of theorizing, they tend to express causality as a complex and dynamic set of interactions. They treat context holistically by drawing connections between macro and micro levels of analysis. As Erika said, contextualized explanation has an affinity with critical realism. And we very much believe that this particular mode of theorizing has a lot of potential for IB scholarship because it offers the possibility to reconcile contextualization and causal explanation as we show on the matrix. So this is how we define contextualized explanation. But Emanuela, how should we go about doing this in practice?
Well, let me say here and share the positive news that it can be done and it has been done. And as a takeaway of our presentation today, we are going to provide some solid examples of how we can do contextualized explanation. And Rebecca and Erika, you already provided some good food for thought in terms of indicating that we have context and explanation together when we do process theorizing or we engage in historical methods. So let me pick up, first of all, process theorizing. We did have a very, very critical discourse around the importance of processes in international business, in as much as ourselves as IB scholars concentrate on the study of dynamic phenomena and processes. Processes are about change, temporality, and flow. Therefore, we move beyond the variance-oriented approach. A process can be envisaged and can be understood and investigated only in the context. Therefore, we have the context element there featuring. A process and process theorizing involves a narrative storyline that essentially reveals mechanisms which are associated or which they bring to light events and activity as they play out over time. Put it simply, when we talk about processes, we talk about a causal chain of events. And in process theorizing, the interesting thing is that the narrative itself, indicating and revealing the mechanisms, context, agency, meanings, and emotions, are the main mechanism for explanation. Now, causal chain of events assumes also that we move beyond cross-sectional data. And I think this is where we also see space for historical methods that actually look backwards, but also they look forward. And history is about explanation. So a good historian aims not to develop a description of things, rather to develop an explanation which is space-bound and time-bound. So if oneself asks what historical research is all about, well, historical research is essentially about contexts, change over time, complexity, contingency, and causality. Moving to the extended case study method, now this is a method that it has been used for quite some time. So it has been around for a few years, from the 50s and 60s. It became a bit more popular with the work of Michael Barraway, who is a sociologist. Now, the extended case study method suggests that what a researcher should do, he or she should try to connect the micro to the macro, connect the present to the past in a way to foresee the future. Now, let me make it a bit more graspable here. Barraway was a sociologist very much inspired by ethnography. So his approach is rather ethnographic. It is very much observation-based. In other words, he concentrates on the locale, on the explanation taking place in the locale, on the dialogue between the participant and the researcher, and then extends this dialogue into another level of abstraction, the dialogue between the process and the context, and then the dialogue between theories. And obviously, talking about causality, we cannot miss here the qualitative comparative analysis or approaches that touch upon complex causality. What do we mean by that? Is that in doing so, causality is not considered to be singular. In other words, we might have multiple configurations of causal factors that can generate some sort of an outcome. So qualitative comparative analysis to this end is blending qualitative and quantitative approaches to try and make sense of this multiple causality. Now, what is common in all these perspectives is that now we are talking about abductive reasoning, an abductive approach. In other words, we move beyond the myth of induction indicated and endorsed by Eisenhower. Again, let me make this a bit more graspable by indicating that when we deploy an abductive approach in our research, the important thing is that familiarity with pre-existing literature is not a limitation, it's not a barrier, but essentially it facilitates the researcher to enter the field so it can be an advantage. During fieldwork, ourselves as researchers, we enter the field with our own pre-existing understandings. We challenge theories, we revisit theories, we drop theoretical lenses, we refine and extend theories. And another common aspect in all these approaches that I have just indicated is that they move beyond this propositional theorizing that Catherine and Rebecca mentioned at the beginning of this presentation today. So we engage in different theorizing styles, in different idioms to explain and discuss the representations we have generated in the field. And these idioms are, for instance, for process theorizing or historical methods, I have already indicated the importance of the narrative having explanatory power. And for other approaches, such as, for instance, a qualitative comparative analysis approach, we might also have typological theorizing that aims at considering manifestations of different phenomena and the factors that actually trigger this phenomenon. Now, if these are the toolkit that we have, so if these are the different ways to engage in contextualized explanation, well, the million-dollar question for Catherine is, have we utilized them in IB?
Okay, so we'll turn now to what's actually been happening in the decade since the paper. And some colleagues and I have gone through all of the issues of GIBS to take a look. And it'd be wonderful to say that our paper had a transformative effect on GIBS. It may do, but it hasn't yet. So let me take the bad news first. The bad news is that the paper and the special issue in which it appeared has not led to a flourishing of qualitative methods in GIBS yet. Not in the past decade anyway. In fact, unfortunately, articles based on any sort of primary research at all became a bit of an endangered species in GIBS over the past decade. Also too, the Eisenhower model, which you can see that we are quite critical of in the paper, is still dominant when you look at the qualitative research that's being published. So you might say that the impact of our award-winning paper perhaps has not been as great as what we would have hoped. But having said that, we can see occasional deviations from the Eisenhardt template found in GIBS, just not often enough in our view. And you do see instances of, for example, process theorizing appearing now. And in some of the examples that we'll give you at the end of the session, you can see that even the extended case method has made an appearance now in GIBS. And we would also like to emphasize that change is necessarily slow. And we think we do have a firmer foundation now than we did 10 years ago. There are more reviewers in particular now who are familiar with not just how to evaluate qualitative research, but familiar with different traditions of qualitative research as well, which is a really important foundation to have for the future. So overall, we do think that there is some optimism for the decade ahead, and we look forward to seeing what happens. But let's move then to the future and what we would like to see the future of qualitative research in IB to be.
So let's see what happens. Obviously, we are here today to advocate pluralism, not pluralism for the sake of pluralism, but highlighting that there are different ways that we can produce knowledge and different ways that we can contribute to the area of international business. As Catherine indicated, indeed, it seems that the last decade, it has been a fermentation period. So what we have done is we have tried to set the foundation, develop some sort of a structure, and we feel that in the next decade, we will be able to capitalize on this structure. The critical discourse is there, the dialogue is there, so we are hoping that now we can take forward this dialogue. And please bear in mind, like, you know, with any convention, conventions take time to change. What we want to see in the next decade happening is moving towards the thick data, a more in-depth contextualized understanding of international business, moving beyond the big data. Oftentimes, as IB scholars, we have been considering that big data is our hallmark. But essentially, well, there are other ways to do research as well. Perhaps it's time to move beyond the number of case studies and justifying why 4 or 6 case studies are better. Perhaps it's a good idea to move beyond golden numbers, for instance, X numbers of transcripts or pages in the transcripts and so on. And I think that most importantly, moving on and considering the future, it is about challenging dichotomies. So challenging dichotomies, for instance, between qualitative and quantitative research, see how we can capitalize on joining forces, challenging dichotomies in terms of deductive and inductive. There are ways that we can actually engage in both modes of reasoning, and abductive reasoning is reconciling induction and deduction, bringing together the context of discovery and the context of justification. Moving beyond dichotomies such as single versus multiple case study designs, now we already know that there is a blurring boundary between the two, and we can accommodate comparisons, but also in-depth understanding of the context, contextualization, using both designs to case study research.
Yeah, so we'd also very much like to see different types of theoretical contributions represented in the journals. As we've discussed, the propositional theorizing style has been dominant, not just in qualitative research in management, but also in IB. And there are other ways to theorize. There are other theoretical contributions you can make. We've discussed that if we want to move more towards, for example, historical research or interpretive research, we'll have to move beyond what we see theory to be and what we see a theoretical contribution to be. This is a challenge not just for authors, of course, but for reviewers. when reviewers are making a determination on is there a theoretical contribution here. So it's a chance for all of us to think about what we do as reviewers, not just as authors. Speaking of which, we would also really like to see reviewers not imposing particular templates for doing qualitative research on authors, and to say that there are different ways to do a case study and be appreciative of that. We do regard with some concern the rise of another template, the Joya template. It's appearing more and more in management journals, and we also see it raising its head in IB. We don't want to see the rise of another template. Neither do we want our paper just to be cited very ritualistically. We do understand that people use it to legitimize case studies, and that's well and good. But I think what we've been trying to emphasize today in our presentation is that we're not just trying to say, yes, doing case studies is okay and you can make a theoretical contribution from it, but we're also trying to diversify the sorts of case studies that appear in our journals. And that's why we'd very much appreciate going beyond this sort of, oh yeah, well, we need a citation. How about we fling in Welch et al. 2011? We really hope that that's not how our paper gets used in the future. And last but not least, you can see on the slide, we'd very much advocate having a vibrant discussion as a community of scholars as to how we produce research. And when I say vibrant, one that everyone can join in, not just gatekeepers, but also stakeholders, active researchers, students. We need everyone to be thinking about it. I like to say that methodology is not a rule book. It's not a set of rules to follow. It's a debate. It's a conversation. We need to, as a field, to be talking about how we produce knowledge and what sort of assumptions are potentially limiting us in understanding the world around us. So conversations are important, and that's why, Tama, we're very thankful actually that you've been able to start this conversation today, and we thank you very much for hosting it.
And we thank you, everyone, the team here. Amazing and informative session here, super efficient. You gave us, I think, the highlighted the key contributions of your paper, and also your hopes for a little bit of change in the way, I think, not only we do research, but also how we train our doctoral students. And I think part of the reason why we've seen this bias and neglect of qualitative research is the way we train our students in doctoral programs and keep asking them, you know, this is the only way to go. You have to study the econometric series and you have to be self-sufficient and all this. There's nothing wrong with qualitative analysis, quantitative analysis, but these are complementary approaches. And I think what young scholars need to remember that the phenomena we study in business, in general, international business in particular, is dynamic phenomena. So take internationalization process. It is a process. So managers and companies evolve and firms evolve. They go through process, and cross-sectional studies can provide so many answers to complexity of these dynamic processes. So therefore, I think we need to remind young scholars, and you may have some ideas about the way to get started, for example, for young scholars, some advice perhaps, that early on, especially in researching a new phenomenon, and I think early on in the development of a scholar, qualitative case-based research is very important, very germane, very critical, because it gets us into deeper explanations like you all have argued today, more thorough, contextualized explanations of interpretations of what's really going on. And there's so much we can learn from cross-sectional studies. And we can be misled as well, as we often do. So if something gets published, even in a top journal, cross-sectional study, I don't necessarily agree with the results if they don't make sense to me, because I haven't seen it play out that way in real life. I don't want to go on here too often, but I think we do have to rethink the way we train and mentor doctoral students, especially in the United States. I think our European scholars and scholars in Australia are better off, I think, by emphasizing and training their students in qualitative methods. And that's, I think, something that everyone should do. So you may have some suggestions. We have a lot of questions and comments, by the way. We have very rich set of comments and appreciation for your presentation here. But how do you think young scholars getting started in international business or business in general, what should they read and how should they train themselves and prepare themselves so they can be self-sufficient in qualitative research?
Yep, thanks, Emma, for your comments. The good news is that it's way easier than it was 10 years ago. And it's also way easier than when we were doing our PhDs, which was considerably before that. When Rebecca and I did our PhDs, we were literally just told, well, here's Yin, here's Eisenhart, go and read it and you can do a case study. I wish that were the case. It's not. It's not that easy. And we have ourselves been involved now in doctoral training for some time because we felt that it didn't have to be that way. You didn't have to reinvent the wheel. And there, particularly in today's Zoom environment, there are plenty of doctoral courses, workshops that you can access online on how to do case studies, how to do qualitative research, taught by really top scholars. So even if your own institution doesn't offer it, there is help available. But aside from these sorts of workshops, seminars, webinars, there is simply more written on the topic than there was 10 years ago. There really has been a flourishing of discussion of how to do case studies, how to do qualitative research in management, and there's also more in international business. So I would simply say read and become part of the conversation. And if you're doing a PhD, don't just think of making a theoretical contribution, you can make a methodological contribution as well, potentially. And I think even more so in international business, because we are researching in these very different contexts. I know, may have joined this webinar from all sorts of different parts of the world. And doing research where you're doing it, how you're doing it, that may be something that you can also write about. So that's something that I'd encourage as well.
Excellent, excellent. I love, by the way, the contrast, Emanuela, between big data versus thick data. I would say rich data, I would say deep thoughts, I would say comprehensive, but thick data. And unfortunately, we see this hype about big data now with the availability of big data sets, and analytical techniques have always been there, but they're now being applied to big data more often. But I think there's quite a few people who are now coming around and recognizing that it's not the answer to valid answers or valid interpretations of big data, because it can mislead you. So I think we have a more balanced understanding of how much big data can provide in the way of reliable insights. And it's not the only answer. So there's a lot of comments and questions here, and feel free to respond to any of them. There is one, our team here. There's one, for example, from Paolo Ritala. How do you see authors, editors, journals could move away from the rigid template following templates are tempting and have sticking power is they act as boundary objects. By the way, authors and readers, what can we do? I think he or she is actually providing the answer too, because it is a template. I mean, unfortunately, it is a template that the reviewers are looking for because they're maybe trained that way. So that's part of the root cause, I think. But any comments on that? Or any of the other questions?
Let me say something, Tamer, on the issue that you mentioned earlier on regarding thick data. Catherine indicated that now we have more opportunities for training, and I think that's extremely important. Let me also explain that obviously collecting thick data is extremely demanding. So if we have the assumption that collecting big data is demanding, thick data is much more demanding, and we need to receive proper training for that, and thankfully there is more available training now. Also, we can actually capitalize on types of data that they have not been traditionally used in international business, and they can provide contextualized insights. So for instance, international business has not used a lot of visual methods, multimodality that currently we discuss in organization research. Let me also reflect on what Paavo said earlier on. Paavo, thank you for your comment. I think there is always a learning process in place, and changing the convention obviously takes time. The matrix that we have provided today, the idea is not to provide boxes and please do not use our matrix as another template. But actually what we want to indicate is that we do have alternatives. And we did provide a critical discourse regarding the convention today. I always say to my students that in order to be able to reflect critically, try to understand, study the convention. Oftentimes, conventions can be useful for PhD students and early career researchers to enter a discipline, but then once you master the convention, also have a critical approach and problematize the convention. So this is part of the process. And I think that this perhaps is something that we wanted to convey with this matrix, that it's not about boxes, but research can actually has a journey. So we might kick off with more an inductive mindset, but as we grow as researchers, there is also a learning process taking place.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Emanuela, can I ask you to stop sharing your slides, then people can see everyone, all of you on the full screen? Thank you. That's great.
Maybe I could chip in on the templates. Tamer, you are asked or forwarded this excellent question about templates, and I think they do provide in a way a security blanket, especially to junior scholars, like a recipe to follow. But at the same time, they often tend to underestimate some of the sort of deep challenges of interpretation. They tend to simplify the process of data analysis in particular and reduce them to predefined steps without perhaps asking whether those steps are the right ones. And I think that's one of the sources for the critique that we've been raising against templates. If they are applied mechanistically, you may lose sight of some of the contextual factors that should be figured in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent.
I could add to what Rebecca just said to younger scholars is that don't take methods for granted. Try to familiarize profoundly on the ontological and epistemological sides of them. It's so easy to just take a method and apply it, but we should really understand why we apply them and how they are usable. And as mentioned, I use the metaphor many times when I teach that methods are molding clay in a way that we can modify them and apply them to our purposes. We just have to be very transparent when we justify our choices, and then we also need to kind of convince others that it's a proper use of a proper method to a proper topic.
Excellent. Thank you, Erika, as well. Heiko Schmidt asks a question, makes a comment. With regards to integrating context into explanations, how would you compare qualitative work grounded in practice or process ontologies with the critical realist ontology approach that you proposed? So I guess we're coming at it from a point of study and practice, which is, there's nothing wrong with that. Obviously, by talking to practitioners, we get these richer, fuller, more comprehensive insights. But any comments or thoughts on that?
I can say something because there is, I think, in the question an issue of combining process theorizing with critical realism, if I have this, I picked it up correctly. And I think that critical realism as a paradigmatic perspective can support process theorizing. From an ontological aspect, critical realism adheres to a stratified ontology, where we have mechanisms giving rise to events, and then we have experiences that we can actually observe. I think in itself, this is very much a causal chain of a process, where we essentially have the mechanism generating the event, and then as a researchers ourselves being able to observe events and experiences. So in a nutshell, I do not want to provide a very elaborate answer on this, but in a nutshell, considering critical realism and process theorizing could be interesting because critical realism embraces this dynamism and contextual causal logic that is also useful for process theorizing.
Excellent. Thank you, Emanuela.
I think,
Katerina, yeah.
oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. But I think too, the question raises the issue, how do we do contextualized explanation? And this is one of the things we had to think about for this presentation. And it's probably the most common question we get. So we get people coming up to us saying, okay, we like the paper, we're convinced by the matrix, we like that little box up on the right-hand side, but how do we do it? And it's probably the challenge that we have to try to explain better what we see contextualized explanation is looking like and how you can do it. So that's one of the things that we are trying to do today. And in our retrospective piece that we'll be writing, it will be one of the themes. And as Emanuela has discussed, there are actually different ways you can do it. And that's why we'll also be providing some examples of case studies that have been done. So you can see that there is a variety of approaches available. We very much want to emphasize that contextualized explanation is not some abstract concept. There are tools available. And again, the good news is, I think we know much better now than we did 10 years ago how to do it and what different forms of contextualized explanation look like.
Great. Maybe it's related to that. Katerina is asking for a little bit more elaboration on the typology. She's saying it will be interesting to understand better the typological theorizing. Could you elaborate a little bit more? Narrative and contextual is clear. Do you mean typological based on pre-existing concepts in the literature or deductively derived from derived hypotheses? Anybody care to respond to that?
Yeah, so that may be, there may be a reference there, if I'm not misreading the question, to the notion of typological theorizing. So we were discussing different types of theorizing styles, different ways in which you can make a theoretical contribution. There's some really great work that's been done by Jörg Cornelissen, who's a former editor of AMR, who's written on this and whose work we've cited. So in the reference list that you'll be getting at the end of the presentation, you'll see some of his work. And we're very keen for people to read it because he is making this point that in our heads, we need to realize that there are different ways in which you can make a theoretical contribution. And he makes the point that qualitative researchers in particular very often make a contribution in the form of a typology. And so categorizing in instances is what we do very often as qualitative researchers. And when you think about the ways in which qualitative research has made a contribution, it's often to develop a typology. And to answer the question, it is often inductively derived. But of course, you could test existing typologies using case studies as well. We don't put case studies into that left-hand box that Eisenhardt did. You can do more things with case studies than just induction. And yeah, you can also then develop existing typologies using case studies as well. So I think that's perhaps what the question referred to. And yes, we'd be very keen to have a discussion about how typologies can make a theoretical contribution. And if you think of some very groundbreaking work in international business, Bartlett and Gershall, for example, and their typology of multinationals, was hugely impactful, and that was based on field work and on very large data sets of interviews that they did around the world. So that's an example of typological theorizing in our field. That's a great point.
Developing typologies, refining them, validating them, I think is a major contribution to a better understanding of business phenomena. There's one question about instruments, data gathering instruments. This colleague is asking, I'm just wondering how robust the content analysis, for example, going through annual reports of companies and so on, should be in qualitative studies. And I know there's a rich set of tools you are all very good at in terms of data gathering instruments and approaches. Would anybody like to shed some light on that?
Yeah, again, that's a really good point, because we've just been talking about the fact that primary research is disappearing in GIBS, which is a huge concern, I think, to everyone. But the irony is that we're still very much interview-based when it comes to qualitative research. So overall, the field is very reliant on secondary data, but in qualitative research, as Emanuela said, we haven't actually explored a lot of different types of data collection methods. And in fact, some of those sources you mentioned, like annual reports, could be utilized more by qualitative researchers. So I think that is one of the ironies of the field, that on the one hand, we're complaining that there's too much secondary data, but it's not qualitative researchers who are perhaps making as much use of this data source as they might.
And let me say something, Catherine, here. This is also great food for thought, because this is something that we can learn from historical studies, that historical researchers are working with massive archives, and they use different ways to analyze these rich archives by do not compromising context. So I think that there could be also a learning process from that side as well.
And adding to that, I think what we can learn from other disciplines is the source critique. So being critical of interviews, but also annual reports that have been prepared for another audience, and interviews are also in a way constructed situations, performances, if you wish, and we can be critical of those as well.
So we talked about typologies, their merits. Mary Yoko is asking an interesting question here, and saying, are we really boxing? I lost the question here now. When we talk about typologies and matrices, we have a tendency to box research into one category or another. How permeable are your categories? And I know I have my answer, but please provide some of your
maybe I could start it,
yeah.
and others can chip in. this is a good question, and we were struggling with this during the review process actually, and at least sort of the contextualized explanation is a very broad church in a sense that you have many different types of studies that would loosely fit under that umbrella, but could actually span different philosophical orientations. So the categorization wasn't at all clear cut, and we had a number of cases that we had to or articles that we had to discuss where to put them, because the matrix was in a way a stiff and rigid way of presenting what we found.
And in a sense, what we're doing with that sort of approach academics do, we help practitioners, because the business world, business phenomena is so complex. If you can simplify and do a little bit of oversimplification, it's perfectly fine. Because when you look at, let's say, Harvard Business Review types of articles, that's what they do. They kind of simplify, oversimplify, provide these typologies, 2x3, 2x2, etc., and they love them. So in a sense, I think it makes it has its limitations. It does force sometimes, scenarios into maybe ambiguous categories, but I think it provides simplicity for the practitioners who are looking for some quick insights. Well, unfortunately, our time is up. I'll give you a minute or so for some final thoughts, but we thoroughly enjoyed this session. And thank you so much for your presentation. You've done a lot of preparation, and you're sharing a lot of insights with our colleagues here. Congratulations once again. You are all, each of you is an accomplished scholar, but together, synergistically, you have definitely presented and prepared and published a very seminal paper, groundbreaking paper. And I am optimistic, Catherine, your impact will be felt even better in the next decade. So any last comments or thoughts? Rebecca, maybe we can start with you.
I would just like to thank for this opportunity. It's wonderful to see such an interest in this area. I think that collectively we can make a change in IB for more pluralism and different approaches. That's our wish.
Thank you. Erika?
Yeah, I'm also very pleased that our enthusiasm has also kind of inspired others, and maybe our article has also helped somebody who is struggling with case studies, so provided some hands-on tools and some help. So that's I think the main point of, like, in this community, to help each other push forward the science.
Well said, well said. Emanuela?
I echo Erika, let's work collectively and let's challenge dichotomies and dualisms so we can take IB forward.
And Catherine from Sydney.
Yeah, I'd just like to thank everyone for your interest. It is a great sign for the next decade, despite some of the less optimistic comments that I might have made. And just say that, yeah, we do need to now write a retrospective. So if anyone has any points that they want us to address and ideas for how we could move this conversation forward, then please let us know.
And thank you again to all of you, and thanks to all of our participants.